I'm recording this because the official report won't hold it. The state prefers clean conclusions. Boxes checked, signatures stamped, cause of incident filed under something that can be explained without making anyone lose sleep. Mold, trespassers, weather exposure, electrical failure, a simple chain of events, a simple story. This isn't simple. If you found this audio the way I think you did, tucked somewhere it didn't belong, mislabeled, buried under other things, then you already understand the first rule of that. Place. Nothing stays where you put it. Not your keys, not your footprints, not your thoughts, and especially not paper. I used to laugh at the superstition that paper can carry a place inside it, that a page can hold a smell that isn't just mildew or salt or old ink, that it can hold a temperature, a pressure, a voice. I don't laugh anymore. My name doesn't matter. It won't help you, and it won't help me. On the paperwork, I was a state investigator assigned to a minor interagency discrepancy, an inventory mismatch in a decommissioned coastal monitoring station located in what my directive called the Outer Banks sector. It was written like a harmless thing. Sector. As if the coast is a grid, as if the ocean listens to lines on a map. I've worked storms, missing persons, fraud, facility audits, regulatory violations. I've walked through buildings after fires where everything smelled like wet ash and heartbreak. I've opened drawers that should have been empty and weren't. I've read witness statements that contradicted each other down to the color of the sky. But nothing prepared me for a file that wasn't logged. Not misfiled. Not delayed. Not lost in some clerk's backlog. A file that didn't exist anywhere except where it was hidden. The first time I touched it, I didn't realize I'd made a mistake. Not the kind you can correct either. The kind you make once, and then you're living inside it. It was a plain folder. No red markings, no classified stamps, no warning tape, no dramatic label that would justify the way my hand hesitated over it. It looked like the kind of folder you'd find in any county office if you dug deep enough, sun-faded, slightly warped from humidity, edges soft with age. I remember thinking, absurdly, that it looked tired, like it had been waiting. When I pulled it free, a thin veil of sand slid from between the papers and scattered across the floor in a quiet arc, the way ash falls when you disturb something burned long ago. And then there was the smell. Salt, yes. Old paper, yes. But something else, too. Something like cold metal left out overnight. The scent you notice when you step into a room and your instincts say, leave. You don't know why, only that your body knows before your mind catches up. I should have shut the cabinet. I should have put the folder back. I should have done what we're trained to do when something doesn't match procedure. Document the anomaly, seal the area, request guidance. Instead, I opened it. The first page wasn't a cover sheet. There was no incident summary, no header, no case number. It began in the middle of a sentence, like I'd walked into a conversation already happening. We keep hearing it under the wind. No names, no date, no location. Just that line, typed in blocky, old-fashioned font, uneven, as if the machine that wrote it had a slipping ribbon. Below it, another line. Not real. Real. Not real. I felt my throat tighten. Not because I was scared, yet, but because I could already sense the shape of a problem I wasn't supposed to touch. That phrase had the wrong kind of rhythm. The kind you repeat to yourself when your mind is trying to stay intact. I turned the page. The next page had a date that didn't exist. I don't mean it was smudged or hard to read. I don't mean it was missing a month or written in a different format. I mean it had a day that doesn't belong on any calendar. I stared at it long enough that my eyes went unfocused. I checked it again. The way you recheck a door lock when you're not sure you actually turned the key. And there it was. Stubborn as a bruise. A date that shouldn't be possible. I flipped forward. The file got worse in the way a storm gets worse. Quietly at first, then all at once. Pages were numbered out of order. 1, 4, 3, 9, 2. Some were numbered with letters. Some had no numbers at all. There were witness statements signed by people who, according to the system I had access to, were still missing, still unaccounted for, still open cases. There were typed transcripts of radio calls that ended mid-word, like the speaker had been pulled away from the microphone. There were photographs of dunes and scrub grass with circles drawn in pen, circles around things I couldn't see at first. Then, after staring too long, I'd notice it. A shape that wasn't quite a shadow, a dip in the air. The suggestion of a doorway where no doorway could exist. And then there were the margin notes. Handwritten, thin, hurried strokes, like someone didn't have time to press the pen hard enough. The first margin note I noticed was simple. Don't stay past low tide. That made sense in a coastal place. You can rationalize it. Low tide exposes hazards. Channels shift. People get trapped. I almost felt relieved. Then I saw the next one. If you're reading this, you already arrived. My fingers went cold. I told myself it was a trick of phrasing, a warning written after the fact. But the note wasn't on a cover page. It wasn't addressed to the next investigator. It was written beside a paragraph that described a man in my position. State investigator, assigned to reconcile discrepancies, dispatched to the Outer Banks sector, arriving with a government vehicle and a key ring that didn't quite fit the locks. It described him checking his watch and noticing it was off by 7 minutes. My watch was off by 7 minutes. I remember the exact feeling that spread through me then. Not terror, not yet. It was the sensation of being watched by something that didn't need eyes. A pressure behind the ears. A heaviness in the room. Like the air itself was leaning closer. I closed the folder. I sat very still. I listened to the building settle around me. The ordinary pops of old wood, the distant moan of wind outside, the soft click of a loose vent. Normal sounds, normal place, normal job. I tried to make it normal by force. Then I opened the folder again, as if reopening it would reset the world. But the page I'd been reading wasn't there anymore. I don't mean I lost my place. I don't mean I flipped past it. I mean the entire page. Gone. In its place was a different page, a different paragraph. And in the margin, the same handwriting waited for me like it had been expecting my attention. This time it said, "Stop pretending you can file this away." The words were so blunt, so personal, that my mouth opened and no sound came out. My mind scrambled for procedure again, for the solid comfort of rules. I told myself it was a prank, an internal test, an old file manipulated by board staff. But the cabinet had been locked. The building had been officially inactive. The inventory discrepancy had been signed off by a supervisor I barely knew. The sector designation was a term no one in my office used casually. And there was one more detail, one I didn't want to admit, even to myself. When I'd first opened the folder, it smelled like salt and metal. Now it smelled faintly like my cologne. The one I'd put on that morning without thinking. A tiny, ordinary human habit, suddenly reflected back at me from inside paper that should have been untouched for decades. I felt my pulse in my throat. I swallowed, and the sound seemed too loud in the stillness. I waited for my body to calm down. It didn't. Because that's the second rule of that place. Calm is temporary. You can borrow it, but you can't keep it. I gathered the file, shoved it back into the cabinet, and locked it with a shaking hand. I remember thinking, irrationally, that if the metal door clicked shut, the problem would stay inside. Not real. Real. Not real. That phrase ran through me like a splinter. I left the room. I walked down the hall. I found a window facing the dunes and the thin line of sea beyond them. And there, in the distance, I saw a shape at the edge of the sand. It might have been a person. It might have been a post. It might have been nothing at all. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became of one impossible thing. It wasn't there a moment ago. And then, without any sound I could name, the shape turned. Slowly, deliberately, like it had noticed me noticing it. Not real. Real. Not real. I backed away from the glass. And behind me, somewhere inside the building, I'd been told was empty. A drawer slid open by itself with the softest, most careful patience, as if something had been waiting for me to stop looking outside, as if it preferred me facing inward, as if the file, hidden, unlogged, impossible, was only the first thing it wanted me to open. By the time I convinced myself to step away from the window, the light outside had shifted. That should have been my first clue that time had begun to misbehave. Only a few minutes could have passed, no more than that. I hadn't stood there long enough to justify the way the sun now sat lower, stretched thin and pale across the horizon, like it was being pulled away from the land by something unseen. The dunes looked flatter somehow, smoothed down, as if the wind had been working overtime while my back was turned. I checked my watch again. Still 7 minutes slow. I tapped the glass face, then shook my wrist, the way you do when you want to pretend a problem is mechanical instead of existential. The second hand stuttered, then continued its slow, obedient march. Normal. Everything was normal if I refused to look too closely. That's another rule I learned out there, though I didn't know it yet. The place will let you believe what you need to believe, right up until the moment it can't anymore. I forced myself back into motion. Movement has always been my way through discomfort. As long as I'm walking, inspecting, taking notes, I can pretend I'm in control. Stillness is where doubt creeps in. The hallway outside the records room was longer than it should have been. I know that sounds like an exaggeration, but I've measured spaces for a living. I know the difference between memory playing tricks and something being physically wrong. That corridor stretched on in a way that didn't match the building's footprint. The doors along it were evenly spaced, identical, each with a small frosted window and a metal plaque stripped bare of lettering. No names, no functions, just doors. I passed 3, then 4, then 5. I stopped at the 6th and turned around. Behind me, the hallway ended after 4 doors. I stood there for a long time, staring at the blank wall where the corridor should have continued. I didn't touch it. I didn't test it. Some instincts are older than training, and every one of them told me not to put my hands on that wall. I told myself I'd miscounted. Stress does that. Fatigue. The human brain is very good at editing reality to protect itself. So I turned back around. 6 doors again. I walked faster this time, my footsteps sounding too loud in my own ears. I passed the first door, then the second. I didn't look into the windows. I didn't want to see anything that might make it harder to keep going. At the end of the hall was a stairwell. Concrete. Rusted railings. A red exit sign that glowed faintly, even though the power was supposedly cut. I took the stairs 2 at a time, eager for the grounding weight of the ground floor. The lobby was smaller, more familiar. A check-in desk. A cork board with outdated safety notices curling at the corners. A rack of pamphlets about coastal erosion and migratory bird patterns. The kind of place that once hosted school groups and interns and bored seasonal staff. Now it felt like a set after the actors had gone home. I dropped my bag on the desk and pulled out my notebook. Writing things down has always helped me reclaim a sense of order. Facts don't lie, even when people do. Location: decommissioned coastal monitoring station, Outer Banks sector. Purpose of visit: inventory discrepancy, records audit. Observations: structural anomalies, unsecured file not listed in system, possible evidence of unauthorized access. I paused, pen hovering. Possible evidence of unauthorized access felt inadequate. Dishonest even. But I wasn't ready to write what I was actually thinking. Putting it on paper would make it harder to dismiss later. I flipped to a fresh page and tried again. Personal note: this place feels wrong. I stared at the sentence, then crossed it out hard enough to tear the paper. Professionalism matters. Or at least it used to. I needed to orient myself, so I stepped outside. The air hit me like a wall, thick with salt and damp heat, pressing in from all sides. The wind off the ocean carried a low, constant sound. Not quite a roar, not quite a whisper. The dunes stretched out ahead, pale and featureless except for the scrub grass clinging stubbornly to the sand. No footprints. That bothered me more than anything else so far. I could see where I'd walked up earlier, the faint impressions leading from the parking area to the entrance. But beyond that, the sand was smooth, untouched. No signs of wildlife, no tracks from maintenance vehicles, no marks from boots or bare feet. It was like the world reset itself beyond the building's threshold. I walked a few steps forward, deliberately dragging my heel to leave a clear line in the sand. I turned back toward the building, then looked down again. The line was gone, not filled in, not softened by wind. Gone. My mouth went dry. I took another step, then another, this time watching my feet the whole way. I saw the sand shift under my weight, felt it give, felt the grain slide around my boot. I turned. Nothing. The dune surface was pristine, unbroken. I laughed then, sharp and a little too loud. A reflex more than a response. The sound died quickly, swallowed by the wind. Not real, I said out loud, testing the words. Real, not real. They didn't help. I backed away from the dunes and returned to the building, the sense of being observed growing heavier with each step. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear movement. But the feeling persisted, like a held breath that wasn't mine. Inside, the temperature dropped immediately. Cool, stale air wrapped around me, carrying the faint smell of old paper and something else. Something I was beginning to associate with the file. Metallic. Cold. I locked the front door behind me, more for comfort than security. The click of the bolt echoed through the lobby. Too loud. Too final. I told myself I'd finish the inventory quickly. Document the discrepancies. Take photos. Leave. I could flag the file for further review without opening it again. That plan lasted exactly as long as it took me to notice the pamphlet rack. One of the pamphlets sat slightly askew, its edge protruding farther than the rest. I hadn't touched it before. I was sure of that. I hadn't even glanced in that direction. The cover read, "Navigating the Outer Banks, Safety and Awareness." I pulled it free. The pages inside were wrong. Instead of tide charts and emergency numbers, it contained dense blocks of typed text. Reports, transcripts, familiar formatting. My chest tightened. The same blocky font as the file. The first page began with a heading. Supplemental Record, Continuity Preservation. Below it, a line I recognized instantly. We keep hearing it under the wind. My hands started to shake. I flipped through the pamphlet, heart hammering harder with each page. Every document inside matched something from the file I'd locked away upstairs. Witness statements, maps, notes in my handwriting. But I hadn't written them. Not yet. One margin note caught my eye, scrawled so hard the pen had nearly torn through the paper. You keep trying to leave. That's not what this job is. I dropped the pamphlet like it had burned me. It hit the floor and slid under the desk, disappearing into the shadow beneath it. I didn't reach for it. I didn't even bend down. Because somewhere above me, deeper inside the building, something moved. Not footsteps? Not exactly. More like a shifting, patient sound, as if the structure itself were adjusting to accommodate a presence that had just woken up. I stood very still, listening, and in that moment, I understood something that the file had been trying to tell me all along. This wasn't a place you investigated. It was a place that investigated you, and I had already given it my name, my scent, my habits. I had opened the file, which meant whether I liked it or not. The process had begun. I didn't go back upstairs right away. I stood in the lobby, staring at the dark space beneath the desk, where the pamphlet had vanished, trying to decide which fear was worse. The idea that it was still there, waiting for me to retrieve it, or the possibility that it had never been there at all. Both felt equally plausible. I told myself I needed evidence, something concrete, something I could photograph, log, and hand over to someone with more authority than me. The kind of thinking that lets you pretend there's a chain of command long enough to reach safety. I retrieved my camera from my bag. It was a standard-issue digital model, nothing fancy, but reliable. I powered it on and aimed it at the empty pamphlet rack. Through the screen, everything looked normal. I lowered the camera. With my eyes alone, the rack was still there. Empty slots, curling paper edges, dust where the missing pamphlet had been. I raised the camera again. The pamphlet was back. Not just back, perfectly aligned, centered, pristine. Its cover stared out at me with polite, institutional reassurance, as if nothing unusual had ever happened. I lowered the camera. Gone. My pulse thudded in my ears. I lifted the camera once more, slower this time, my breath shallow, controlled. There it was again. I took a photo. The shutter clicked, louder than it should have been in the stillness. The pamphlet didn't move. It didn't react. It simply existed inside the frame. I checked the playback. The image showed the rack. Empty. No pamphlet. I scrolled back and forth, heart sinking with each swipe. Every photo showed the same thing, a perfectly ordinary, unremarkable rack with one empty slot. I deleted the images, not because they were useless, but because seeing them felt wrong, like they were erasing something else in the process. That's when I heard the voice. It wasn't loud. It didn't echo. It didn't come from any one direction. It slid into my awareness the way a thought does, so smoothly that for a moment I wasn't sure it wasn't my own. You're skipping ahead. I froze. I didn't answer. I didn't turn around. I stood there with my hands clenched around the camera, knuckles white, every muscle locked. You always do this, the voice continued, calm and patient. You try to understand before you observe. I swallowed. My mouth felt dry, like I'd been breathing dust. I'm not talking to you, I said finally, and the words sounded thin even to me. A pause. Then softly, you are? I turned. The lobby was empty. No figures. No shadows doing anything unusual. Just the desk, the corkboard, the doors leading deeper into the building. I forced myself to breathe. Panic feeds on hesitation. I'd learned that early in my career. You give fear too much room, and it fills every corner. I'm documenting a site, I said, louder now. That's all. Another pause. Then, that's how it starts. The voice wasn't mocking. That might have been worse. It sounded factual, like someone correcting a minor error. I backed toward the stairs, camera still raised, my eyes scanning for movement. The voice didn't follow me physically, but it stayed with me, present in the space between thoughts. The last one said the same thing, it said. So did the one before that. My foot hit the first stair. I gripped the railing, cold metal biting into my palm. Who are you? I asked. Silence. I waited, heart hammering, every nerve straining. Finally, that depends on when you're asking. I climbed the stairs faster than I meant to, my steps uneven. The hallway above looked the same as before, doors lined up like teeth, frosted windows opaque and unhelpful. I didn't count them this time. I went straight to the records room. The cabinet stood exactly where I'd left it. Locked, untouched, solid. I knelt in front of it and checked the lock, then checked it again. Still secure. I hesitated, then unlocked it. The folder was there, but it was thicker. I hadn't noticed that before. I was sure I hadn't. The file had been slim when I first opened it, maybe a couple dozen pages at most. Now it bulged at the seams, the metal fasteners strained, paper edges uneven and warped. I lifted it out carefully, as if it might react badly to sudden movement, and laid it on the table. The top page had changed. It was no longer the fragment I'd first read. Instead, it displayed a clean, centered heading. Case Continuity Log, Outer Banks Sector below it. A list of names. I scanned them quickly, then more slowly. Some were redacted, some were crossed out. Some had dates beside them. The last name on the list was mine. No date. Yet. My stomach lurched. I flipped the page, my hands trembling now despite my best efforts to stay steady. The new pages were different from the earlier ones, less fragmented, more coherent, like the file was settling into a rhythm now that it had something to work with. There were detailed accounts of previous investigators' arrivals, their impressions of the coast, their rationalizations, their early doubts. I recognized myself in every one of them. One passage described a woman who'd been convinced the site was part of an elaborate psychological test. Another man believed it was a stress-induced hallucination brought on by isolation. A third suspected a covert military experiment. All of them kept working. All of them kept taking notes. All of them stayed longer than they intended. I flipped faster, my breathing shallow. The entries grew more erratic as they went on. Sentences repeated. Paragraphs looped back on themselves. Phrases appeared again and again, sometimes entire pages filled with the same three words. Not real. Real. Not real. My throat tightened. Then I reached a section labeled Observer Drift. The handwriting in the margins here was frantic, overlapping, as if multiple hands had fought for space. It's not watching us, one note read. It's checking alignment. Another, we aren't assigned here, we're slotted. Another, written darker, heavier. Stop asking what it is. Ask what it needs. I slammed the folder shut. The sound echoed through the room, too sharp, too final. I'm leaving, I said aloud, my voice cracking despite my resolve. I don't care what this is. I'm done. The words hung in the air for a moment. Then, from somewhere deep within the building, the voice returned, closer now. You can't leave before the encounter, it said. My blood ran cold. What encounter? I asked, even as part of me already knew the answer. The file slid open by itself. Pages flipped, fast at first, then slowing, until they stopped on a page near the end. A page I hadn't seen before. It wasn't typed. It was blank, except for a single sentence written in careful, deliberate handwriting. You've already met it? You just haven't realized which moment counts yet. The lights overhead flickered. I backed away from the table, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I wanted to run, to get out of the building, to reach the open dunes and the illusion of escape they offered. But as I turned toward the door, I saw my reflection in the frosted glass. And for a split second, just long enough to break something inside me, it didn't move when I did. It stayed there, staring forward, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Then it smiled, and I understood, with a clarity that made my knees weak, that the first encounter hadn't been with the file. It had been with the place itself, and it wasn't finished with me yet. I didn't trust the reflection anymore. That realization came quietly, without drama, which somehow made it worse. I had spent my entire career relying on observation. What I could see, document, confirm. Now the most basic confirmation of self had become unreliable. I avoided glass after that. I closed the records room door behind me and leaned my weight against it, as if the thin barrier could anchor me to something solid. My breathing sounded too loud in my own ears, each inhale followed by the intrusive thought that I was being measured by it. Tempo. Duration. Consistency. I forced myself to slow down. Not real. Real. Not real. The phrase no longer felt like a mantra. It felt like a test. I needed to understand the scope of what I was dealing with. Not because understanding would save me, but because ignorance was clearly being punished. The file had made that much obvious. It responded to attention. It adapted. It grew. If I was already part of it, then resistance through denial was pointless. I returned to the lobby and sat at the desk, deliberately positioning myself so I couldn't see any reflective surfaces. I opened my notebook again, hands steadier than they had any right to be. Time of entry unknown. Internal clock unreliable. That sentence felt honest. I began to cross-reference what I'd read in the file with what I remembered from my briefing. The Outer Banks sector had been described as a low-priority administrative zone. Environmental monitoring, outdated infrastructure, minimal traffic. No mention of incidents beyond storm damage and funding disputes. But the file told a different story. According to its contents, there had been at least 12 investigators assigned to this location over the past several decades. Not all consecutively. Some gaps spanned years. Others were only months apart. None of them had completed a final report. None of them were officially listed as deceased. They simply stopped. Missing without escalation. Cases quietly closed. Reassigned workloads. A system smoothing over an absence like sand filling a footprint. I thought of the pristine dunes outside, of how the ground refused to remember me. A pattern emerged as I read deeper. Each investigator arrived under a different pretense. Inventory audit, structural inspection, regulatory review. No two assignments were worded exactly the same, but they all funneled toward the same location. And every single one had accessed the file. Not the same file, I realized. The file. The wording in earlier entries made it clear the folder changed. It adapted to the person opening it. Some described it as a binder, others as a box. One account referred to it as a digital archive that corrupted every system it touched. But the function remained constant. Continuity preservation. That phrase appeared again and again, sometimes typed, sometimes handwritten, sometimes scratched so hard into the page it tore through. Preservation of what? The later entries hinted at an answer, though never directly. They spoke of alignment events and drift correction, of the coast behaving incorrectly, of tides arriving too early or too late, of sounds that preceded weather, not followed it. One investigator, a man with a background in meteorology, wrote extensively about wind patterns that didn't correspond to pressure systems. He described hearing tones embedded within the gusts, subtle but deliberate, like signals layered under noise. He tried to isolate them. He tried to record them. The next page was blank, except for a single line. That was a mistake. I felt a chill settle over me. Not from cold, but from recognition. I hadn't recorded anything yet, but I'd thought about it. The idea had been forming at the edges of my mind, the way it does when you're grasping for proof. The file anticipated intent. I flipped further. The concept of the observer came up repeatedly. Not in the scientific sense I was used to, but in a more narrative way, as if observation itself was a role that needed to be filled. One margin note stood out, written carefully, almost reverently. It doesn't exist without someone to notice the gaps. The gaps. That word followed me as I explored the building further. I checked rooms I hadn't entered yet, guided less by logic than by a growing sense of pressure, like an itch that worsened the longer I ignored it. Some rooms were empty. Some were furnished with outdated equipment, monitors dark, desks layered with dust that never quite settled right. In more than one place, I found chairs positioned as if someone had just stood up. No footprints, no signs of departure. In a small office near the back of the building, I found a wall covered in maps. Not official ones, hand-drawn layered over each other, pinned and taped and scratched into the surface beneath. The Outer Banks coastline repeated again and again, each iteration slightly different. In some, the barrier islands were thinner. In others, they bulged outward, distorted, as if something beneath the surface were pressing up. Red circles marked certain areas, always the same spots, always where the land met the water. In the center of the largest map, someone had written, "This is where it listens." I stared at that line for a long time. The idea was absurd. Land doesn't listen. Places don't listen. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the building itself was aware of my presence. Not in a conscious way, but functionally. Like a sensor tripped by motion. I checked my watch again. Still 7 minutes slow. I pulled out my phone, hoping against reason for a signal. The screen lit up, battery full, but no service indicator appeared. Instead, the time displayed didn't match my watch. It was ahead by 7 minutes. A perfect offset. My stomach dropped. I tried restarting it. The screen went black, then returned to the same display. Same time, same absence of signal. A message notification appeared. No sender, no preview. I hesitated, then opened it. The text was short. "You're sinking." I deleted the message immediately. The phone locked itself. Not powered off. Locked. I pressed the buttons. Nothing. I slid it back into my pocket, suddenly aware of how many small systems I relied on, without thinking. How much of my sense of self was mediated through external confirmations. The file didn't need technology. It didn't need networks. It only needed attention. That realization hit me harder than any voice or movement could have. I understood then why the file was hidden, not sealed. Why it wasn't classified or destroyed. You can't destroy a role. You can only avoid filling it. And someone, somewhere, had decided that avoidance wasn't an option anymore. I returned to the lobby, my thoughts circling tighter, darker. The voice hadn't returned, but its absence felt deliberate, like a teacher stepping back to see if the lesson had landed. I sat down and stared at the front door. I could still try to leave. That option existed, technically. The door wasn't locked from the inside. The dunes were still there, the ocean beyond them. But the file had been very clear about one thing. Leaving wasn't the same as escaping. Not real. Real. Not real. I whispered it under my breath, and for the first time, the words didn't feel like reassurance. They felt like a countdown, because somewhere between my arrival and that moment, the investigation had stopped being about the Outer Banks sector. It had become about whether I was willing to keep noticing what the place needed someone to see. And whether I liked it or not, I was still looking. The first thing that unraveled was the order of events. I didn't notice it immediately. That's the insidious part. Reality didn't shatter. It softened. Edges blurred. Cause and effect loosened their grip just enough that I could still function, still move, still think I was following a sequence. But the sequence was no longer following me. I became aware of it when I found myself standing in the stairwell again, one hand on the railing, without remembering how I'd left the lobby. There was no sensation of lost time, no blankness, no headache. Just an absence where a decision should have been. I looked down at my notebook. There were new notes, written in my handwriting. Same pressure, same slant, same shorthand I'd developed over years of field work. I recognized the way I crossed my T's when I was rushing, the way my A's closed when I was tired. I did not remember writing them. One line stood out, boxed in heavily inked pen. Do not follow the sound inland. Below it, another note, lighter, almost tentative. Too late? My chest tightened. I flipped back a page. More notes. Observations about tide timing. About a low-frequency vibration felt more than heard. About how the building's interior dimensions no longer aligned with its exterior footprint. I had been working. just not where I could remember it. I leaned against the concrete wall, suddenly dizzy, and closed my eyes. The stairwell smelled faintly of rust and damp stone. Ordinary. Grounding. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind, another trick of perception, the way constant noise can shape itself into patterns if you listen too closely. But this wasn't random. It had rhythm, a slow, hollow sound, rising and falling, like breath drawn through a vast, empty space. It wasn't coming from the building. It was coming from inland, from beyond the dunes. Every instinct I had screamed at me not to follow it. The note in my own handwriting echoed that warning, urgent and absolute. Do not follow the sound inland. I opened my eyes. The sound was still there. It wasn't louder, but it felt closer, as if distance no longer applied in the way I understood it, as if the sound existed wherever attention touched it. I forced myself down the stairs and back into the lobby. The front door stood where it always had, sunlight leaking around its edges in thin, pale lines. The sound seeped through those cracks. I backed away from the door. "No," I said out loud, my voice unsteady. "I'm not doing that." The sound didn't change. It didn't react. It simply continued, patient and immense. I turned away and nearly collided with the desk. On it sat the pamphlet, the same one that had vanished earlier, the same one that only appeared through the camera. Now it rested in plain sight, neatly centered, its cover uncreased and clean. I hadn't put it there. I approached it slowly, my movements careful, controlled. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. It was open. The pages fluttered gently, though there was no breeze inside the building. The text inside had changed again. This time, it wasn't reports or transcripts. It was a map. Not of the Outer Banks as they exist on any chart I'd seen, but of something adjacent to it. An inland space that shouldn't have been there. Marshland stretched far beyond its known boundaries. Narrow paths wound through reeds and shallow water, looping back on themselves in impossible ways. And there, at the center, marked with a small, precise dot, was the building. Behind it, drawn in darker ink, was a line extending inland, toward the sound. A note beneath the map read, "Alignment requires exposure." My reflection wavered in the desk's polished surface, just enough to catch my attention. I didn't look directly at it. I couldn't. "Not real," I whispered. "Real, not real." The sound deepened. It was no longer just a presence. It was a pull. I understood then that the warning in my notes hadn't been a prohibition. It had been a record, a marker left behind by a version of me that had already reached the point I was approaching now. Too late? I grabbed my jacket and stepped toward the door before I could reconsider. The rational part of my mind screamed that this was exactly what the place wanted, that every step inland was another concession. But another thought pushed through, colder and more terrifying. If I didn't follow it, something else would. The door opened without resistance. The air outside felt heavier than before, pressing against my skin, thick with damp heat and the scent of brine and rot. The dunes behind me looked flatter, less defined, as if erosion were accelerating in real time. Ahead, the land stretched inland in a way it hadn't earlier, where there should have been a clear line between sand and scrub. There was now a gradual bleed, sand dissolving into marsh, marsh dissolving into shallow water. The sound emanated from somewhere within that space, directionless but undeniable. I took a step forward. The ground held. Another step. Still solid. With each movement, the sound seemed to adjust, not growing louder, but clearer, more structured. Layers emerged within it, subtle shifts in tone that suggested pattern, communication. I stopped and looked back. The building was still there, but it seemed smaller somehow, less important. like a remembered place rather than a current one. For a moment, I considered running back, slamming the door, barricading myself inside and waiting until someone came looking for me. Then I remembered the file. No one had come looking for the others. The sound changed, not in volume, but in quality. It felt closer to language now, though still beyond comprehension. My skin prickled, every nerve alert. I realized, with a creeping dread, that the sound wasn't guiding me deeper into the marsh. It was responding to my movement, adjusting, learning. I had the distinct, horrifying sense that I wasn't following it. I was sinking with it, and somewhere behind me, back in the building I could no longer fully picture, the file was updating, adding another layer, another observer, another attempt at continuity. Not real, real, not real. The phrase pulsed through my thoughts in time with the sound, and for the first time since arriving, I wondered if the coast itself wasn't the anomaly. If instead, it was the only thing holding something much larger in place, something that needed witnesses. And I was walking straight into its field of view. The marsh didn't behave like land. That was the first undeniable truth I encountered once I passed the point where the dunes should have ended. The ground beneath my boots wasn't unstable in the way mud is unstable. It didn't shift or sink or pull at me. It held my weight with quiet confidence, as if it had already decided where I was allowed to stand. The sound, because by then I had no other word for it, was everywhere and nowhere. It wasn't directional anymore. I couldn't point to it and say, there, that's where it's coming from. It filled the space the way pressure fills deep water, equal on all sides. I realized I was no longer listening with my ears. I was registering it in my chest, in my teeth, in the soft space behind my eyes, where thoughts begin before they have words. I stopped walking. The sound did not stop with me. That should have terrified me. Instead, it brought a strange clarity, a cold understanding that made my hands steady and my breathing slow. This wasn't a chase. This wasn't a lure. It was an overlap. The marsh stretched out ahead, dotted with pools of still water that reflected the sky too perfectly. The clouds above looked wrong, stretched thin, elongated, like reflections themselves. For a moment, I couldn't tell which direction was up. I checked my watch again. It was no longer 7 minutes slow. It had stopped entirely. The second hand was frozen mid-tick, caught between moments. The glass felt warm against my skin, like it had been held too long. I took it off and slipped it into my pocket, unwilling to look at it anymore. Time had already made it clear it wasn't interested in cooperating. As I moved deeper into the marsh, the sense of being observed intensified. Not from behind, not from above, but from within the space itself. Like walking into a room where every surface is aware of you, even if nothing has eyes. I began to notice shapes at the edge of my vision. Not figures, not silhouettes, absences, places where the reeds bent without wind, where water rippled without disturbance, where reflections lagged behind reality by the smallest, most unsettling margin. I told myself not to look directly at them. I failed. The first time I turned my head too quickly, I caught a glimpse of something that made my stomach drop. It wasn't a creature. It wasn't anything that could be described in physical terms. It was a misalignment. The space between two reeds folded inward on itself, creating a depth that shouldn't have been there. Like a doorway pressed flat, waiting for the right angle to open. I looked away immediately, heart racing. Not real. Real, not real. The phrase barely registered anymore. It had lost its power as reassurance. Now, it felt like a label applied after the fact. A way of categorizing something that didn't care what category it was placed in. I pressed on. The ground rose slightly, forming a low ridge of tangled roots and compacted earth. At the top stood something that made me stop short. A marker. It looked like a survey stake, the kind used in preliminary land assessments. A simple wooden post, weathered but intact, driven firmly into the ground. There was no reason for it to be there. No markings, no flagging tape, no numbers, just the post. As I approached, I saw that someone had carved into it with a blade. Not words, not symbols, tallies. Dozens of them, etched deeply, overlapping in places where space had run out. Some were old, worn smooth by time and weather. Others were sharp and fresh, the wood still pale where it had been cut. I reached out, then stopped myself. I didn't need to touch it to understand what it represented. Attempts, iterations, observers. My chest tightened as I counted the most recent marks. They stopped one short of where my hand hovered. I stepped back, my pulse roaring in my ears. The sound in the air shifted subtly, responding to my reaction. Not pleased, not displeased, acknowledging. Beyond the marker, the marsh opened into a wide, shallow basin. The water there was dark, almost black, its surface smooth as glass. No insects skimmed it. No plants broke through. At the center of the basin was a shape that didn't belong. It wasn't rising out of the water. It wasn't floating. It was embedded. At first glance, it looked like a structure. Part of a building, maybe, or the remains of one. A flat plane of dark material angled slightly upward, edges disappearing beneath the surface. As I stared, recognition crept in, slow and nauseating. It wasn't a structure. It was a surface, a boundary. And it was wrong in the same way the reflections had been wrong. Too perfect. Too complete. I knew, without knowing how, that this was what the file had been orbiting. This was the reason the sector existed. The reason continuity had to be preserved. This was where the gap was thinnest. I took another step forward. The sound surged, not louder, but fuller, as if more of it had come into alignment with me. Images flashed through my mind, unbidden. The lobby, the file, the names crossed out and replaced. The margin notes written by hands that had once been confident. I saw myself from above, a small figure in a wide, empty space, moving towards something that did not need to move toward me. I understood then that the investigators hadn't vanished. They hadn't been taken. They had been placed, distributed along the boundary, each one holding a position until drift made them ineffective, until replacement was required. My legs trembled, but they didn't stop. Fear had become irrelevant. Fear assumes an outcome you can avoid. This was maintenance. As I reached the edge of the basin, the surface of the water began to change, not rippling, realigning. The reflection of the sky fractured into overlapping versions, each slightly offset. In one of them, I saw myself standing still. In another, I saw myself already stepping forward. In a third, I saw nothing at all. The sound resolved into something almost like a voice. Not words, but intent. A pressure that conveyed meaning without language. Witness, anchor, stay. I fell to my knees at the edge of the water, overwhelmed by the weight of it. Tears stung my eyes, not from emotion but from strain, like my mind was stretching beyond its design. "I'm not enough," I whispered. "I don't understand you." The surface of the basin responded. A shape formed within it, not emerging, not approaching, but aligning with my position. The absence I'd seen before sharpened, edges becoming clearer, deeper. It didn't need me to understand. It needed me to notice. And in that moment, with the sound filling every part of me and the boundary waiting patiently in front of me, I realized the worst truth of all. The investigation was almost complete, and I was running out of places to stand. I don't remember standing up. I remember being upright. There's a difference. One implies effort, choice, intention. The other feels like a condition that was applied to me once the space decided I was ready for it. The basin didn't move. It didn't advance or retreat, but the sense of distance between us collapsed, like a measurement that had lost its unit. I was close enough now that the air above the surface felt different, thicker, resistant, as if I were pressing my face near a pane of glass I couldn't see. The sound was no longer something I could separate from myself. It had threaded into my thoughts, smoothing them, aligning them, stripping away anything that didn't fit. I realized then why the file had grown thicker. It wasn't collecting data. It was shedding error. The notes, the reports, the transcripts. They weren't records of what happened. They were adjustments, attempts to describe the same thing from slightly different angles. Correcting for drift each time, language failed to capture it cleanly. Language was the problem. I felt it clearly now. Words were blunt instruments, designed for a world that stayed where it was put. This place, this boundary, existed between definitions. It wasn't land or water, sound or silence, real or unreal. It was alignment. And I had been brought here because I could still notice when things didn't line up. The realization hollowed me out. I thought of the names in the file, the crossed out ones, the ones without dates, the people who had come before me, each convinced they were documenting an anomaly instead of participating in a process. I wondered how long each of them had lasted. Days? Weeks? Years? I wondered if they had stood where I was standing now, feeling the same terrible clarity settle in their bones. "You don't need to stay," I said, though I wasn't sure who I was speaking to. The words felt thin as soon as they left my mouth. "You've managed without me before." The response wasn't a denial. It was an adjustment. The space around the basin shifted subtly, like a lens refocusing. I became aware of other positions along the boundary, not physically visible, but present in the same way gravity is present. Points of tension, evenly distributed, holding something vast in check. Some felt stable. Others felt thin. That was when I understood why the Outer Banks sector existed at all. It wasn't special because something was wrong there. It was special because something was almost wrong everywhere else. The coast was a compromise, a flexible edge, a place where land and water already negotiated their existence every day. It was easier to anchor something there than in a rigid interior. The basin wasn't a breach. It was a seal, and seals require maintenance. I laughed then, a short broken sound that startled me with its bitterness. "So what?" I said, my voice shaking. "I just stand here? I become part of the scenery?" The answer came not as a voice, but as a feeling of inevitability. Of course not. Nothing so simple. Standing still was never the goal. Observing was. The file flashed through my mind again. The way it updated, rewrote, rearranged itself. The way it adapted to whoever opened it. I saw it clearly now. The file wasn't for the investigators. It was for the system. A way to externalize awareness, to keep a record of what was being noticed and by whom, when one observer drifted too far, when fear, denial, or understanding finally overwhelmed them. The system compensated. It sent someone else. I felt a sharp pang of anger then, hot and sudden. "You're using us," I said. "You're burning people to keep this intact." The basin did not react, because that framing didn't matter. Use implies intent, cruelty, choice. This was closer to physics. Pressure equalizing, stress redistributed. If a beam cracks, you reinforce it. You don't apologize to the beam. I sank to my knees again, the strength draining from my legs. Exhaustion flooded me, deeper than anything I'd felt before, not physical, existential. "How long?" I asked quietly. "How long does this last?" The answer came as an image, not a future, not a duration, a role. I saw myself back in the building, older somehow, thinner, writing notes in the margins of a file that no longer felt hostile, just necessary. I saw myself noticing changes, small ones at first, a tide out of sync, a sound under the wind. I saw myself marking tallies into a wooden post with a blade that fit my hand perfectly. I saw the moment I would write the warning not to follow the sound inland. I saw the moment I would write "too late" beneath it. The loop closed. Tears slid down my face, unnoticed, unimportant. Grief came then, real and sharp, not for my life, whatever this would become, but for the certainty I'd had before. The faith in process, in distance, in the idea that you could observe something without it observing you back. Not real. Real, not real. The phrase surfaced again, unbidden. I understood it now. It wasn't a question of truth. It was a stabilization technique, a way to keep the mind from collapsing under the weight of overlapping states. I stood. The basin waited. I took one final look back toward where the dunes should have been, where the building should have stood. I couldn't see it anymore. The marsh extended in all directions now, seamless and patient. There was no audience for this moment, no record. That, I realized, was the final kindness. I stepped forward, not into the water, not across a threshold, but into a position that felt suddenly, horribly correct. The sound settled. The pressure equalized, and something vast, something I could never fully understand, relaxed. Just a little. I don't know how much time passed after that. I know only this. When the next investigator arrives, they will think they are alone. They will find a file that isn't logged. They will open it. And somewhere along the coast, I will notice the shift. Because noticing is the job. And now, finally, I understand why no one ever finished the report. I don't know when this became a recording. That's the last uncertainty I have left, and I'm not even sure it belongs to me anymore. At some point, the act of noticing turned inward. Observation folded back on itself, and I became aware of the way my own thoughts left impressions. Subtle distortions, like footprints that only appeared from certain angles. I learned to catalog them the way I once cataloged evidence, calmly, methodically, without attachment. That's how you survive here. Not by resisting, not by believing, by noticing without reaching for meaning too quickly. The building still exists, in a way. Sometimes I'm there. Sometimes I'm not. The file remains. Because it has to. It's leaner now, more efficient. It doesn't waste space on speculation. Only patterns. Only deviations that require correction. Your name isn't in it yet. That's important. If you're hearing this, it means the system still has enough slack to allow for warning. That hasn't always been the case. There were periods, long ones, where no warnings were left behind at all. Where replacements arrived without context and vanished without echo. Those were dangerous times. You should understand something before you decide what this is. This isn't a confession. It isn't a warning in the heroic sense either. I'm not saving you. I can't. I don't even know who you are. This is documentation. The last kind that still matters. The Outer Banks sector was never about geography. The name was a convenience, a way to localize something that doesn't truly respect location. Coasts were chosen because they move, because they negotiate, because they already exist in a state of compromise. Rigid places break faster. People do too. If you're listening to this as part of your job, then you already know something is wrong. You wouldn't be here otherwise. The file doesn't surface unless it needs to. It doesn't open unless you're capable of seeing past the first layer. That's the qualification no one writes down. You're probably telling yourself that you'll just review the materials, that you won't stay long, that you'll keep a professional distance and escalate anything unusual through the proper channels. That thought has already been accounted for. Distance is an illusion here. Escalation is just another form of alignment. I wish I could tell you there's a moment where it becomes unbearable, where you'll know for certain that you've crossed a line and can still turn back. There isn't. It happens gradually, softly. You'll start noticing small discrepancies, a sound that doesn't match the wind, a reflection that lags just a fraction too long, notes you don't remember writing but can't deny belong to you. You'll rationalize them. That's fine. Rationalization buys time. Time is useful. Eventually, you'll understand that the job was never to solve anything. There is nothing to solve. The system is already complete. It just requires maintenance. Awareness drifts, attention wanes, gaps widen. Someone has to stand in the right place and notice when that happens. Right now, that someone is me. I don't know how long that will remain true. I feel the pressure changing sometimes, subtle but persistent. There are positions along the boundary that feel thinner than they used to. Strained. That's why this recording exists. Not as a plea, as a handoff. If you choose to walk away, if you manage it, you'll forget most of this. The file will blur in your memory. The details will lose their edges. You'll tell yourself it was stress, or miscommunication, or a badly managed archive. The system will allow that, if it can afford to. If you don't forget, if something in you keeps circling back, replaying phrases you don't remember learning, then you were always closer than you thought. In that case, pay attention to the margins. Pay attention to what repeats. And when you hear something under the wind, something that doesn't quite belong to the weather, do yourself one kindness. Notice where you are standing when you hear it, because that's how it begins. And if you're hearing this at all, then somewhere along the coast, something has already shifted. I'm still here, not real. Real, not real. And if you don't believe me, that's fine. You don't have to. It already knows where you are.